Chairperson. So I'd like to extend the affirmative case in two ways. The first on the issue of rehabilitation, and second on the issue of backlash and social sanction. But before I move on to the issues, I would like to make three responses to the previous speaker. So one, his basic claim was to say that this policy would necessarily undermine a sense of retribution, the sense and the ability of the victim's feeling to have a sense of catharsis through the process of criminal justice system. Now he had to respond back to my partner's argumentation and being more comparative. We think that in general cases, victims are reasonable and they understand, in vast majority of cases of juvenile at a trial, that parental education and parental influence had a huge effect in how that child grew up and having particular aggressive or violent behavior. So the current situation is rather undermining the sense of catharsis that parents have against that juvenile offense, because they see that a 15-year-old kid gets, I don't know, 15 to 20 years in sentence, but the actual parents who allow that 15-year-old kid to have and grow up a sense of criminal behavior do not get any criminal sanctions, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that our policy, rather when you consider the victim feeling, is much more better. Second, on the issue of rehabilitation, he simply asserted that comparatively, compared to our policy, that the status quo is much better when you consider rehabilitation. But he didn't actually explain the reason why, the mechanism why the current status quo in terms of juvenile rehabilitation really works. We think that in the status quo, the juvenile rehabilitation oftentimes fail because you do not allow parents and the juvenile offender to execute a sense of like joint responsibility and joint compensation, because the child feels more isolated, that he is the only one who has to bear all the legal responsibility and bear all the social sanction. And once he comes out, like 5 or 10 years in the future in society, now he has a very difficult time reconciling with his parents, who he might still have a problem with, ladies and gentlemen. So when you consider rehabilitation, as I will explain later in my substantive, we think that our policy is much more better. The third response is to them saying that it's not just the parents who affects the child's behavior and criminality. It could be the case that that child might have hanged out with the wrong kind of kids. Now, number one, that is true, but that is why we're not forcing this policy upon the parents. We're simply allowing this to the parents if they feel that their way of education, their way of allowing that child to grow up, if they feel that they think that they are responsible of that child having that particular aggressive or violent behavior, that they are allowed to take that responsibility. So we're not forcing this upon them. We don't think this undermines the very principle that they were considered. But second of all, if the parents feel responsible for not letting their own child hang out with, I don't know, kids from the gang membership, like we think that our policy allows those parents to take their responsibility and share that social sanction. So the first issue that I want to deal is on the issue of rehabilitation. Now, what we heard constantly coming from the negative is that if we take this policy, this undermines the effectiveness of rehabilitation, because you comparatively decrease the amount of prison sentence sanction to that child. Now, three responses here. Number one, even in juvenile offense cases, punishment is not sanctioned, like purely considering rehabilitation, right? Factors such as deterrence, as they mentioned, factors such as the sense of retribution are also considered when the jury sentenced a particular prison sentence. That is why sometimes, even in juvenile cases, we see cases of life imprisonment. Therefore, what we can conclude is just because we decrease prison sentence doesn't necessarily mean that automatically undermines our state's ability to rehabilitate that child properly. But second of all, we think that our model only allows a fraction of that prison sentence to be proxied by the parents. So for example, if a juvenile offender gets sentenced 10 years in prison, he will still have to serve, 8 years in prison, even if his or her parents proxy the other 2 years prison sentence. So it's quite common, ladies and gentlemen, that even in the status quo, the juvenile offender gets released, 1 to 2 years earlier, prior to the maximum sentence, because they were behaving good in that particular prison. So this proves that the current justice system or the current prison system already considers 1 to 2 years shortened sentence does not severely undermine the state's or the prison ability to rehabilitate that particular individual. But the third response here is that our policy rather enhances rehabilitation, because as Mr. Shi told you, we allow parents to willingly and actively show that they're wearing a prison jumpsuit, that they're being cuffed, handcuffed, like they are being fired from their job and they're limited all of their freedom by going to the prison. that is when you allow like more possibility of that child and parent reconciling, because now that child can visually and directly become more aware of that parent's taking direct responsibility, not just paying money, ladies and gentlemen. So moving on to my final issue, which is on the issue of backlash and social sanction. Before that, okay. So backlash and social sanctions. So we think that in the status quo, parents of juvenile offenses and juvenile offenders oftentimes face excessive social sanctions. For example, losing their job, chased by the media and always bashed by the media, moreover getting death threats from people all over the country. Like, that's especially true in the context of places such as Japan or South Korea, when you have a culture of the elderly position or the parent position taking responsibility of the juvenile, where that kind of culture is very strong. So right now in the status quo, parents have to bear that kind of social sanction, which is not sanctioned legally, it's just sanctioned by the society. And oftentimes this is not a rare case that like a parent of a serious juvenile offense such as murder actually commits suicide because they cannot simply bear the psychological burden of undergoing that social sanction, because they don't have an alternative avenue to express to the society of taking legal responsibility. We give the alternative avenue in our policy, because now parents now have a legal way, a legal avenue to show to the society that they are actively taking responsibility for the horrible crimes that that child have committed. By even in those kind of contexts, we think the criminal punishment also have a severe narrative of considering as a very severe punishment. So we don't think that this would completely and automatically decrease all the social sanction that a parents will receive if their child commits horrible crimes, but we think that comparatively compared to the status quo, we think that parents the degree and the horrible amount of social sanction that parents will receive will relatively decrease, in which we believe it is a much more healthier punishment against that parents in receiving. Yes, comparatively to the status quo, relatively less social sanctions, but at the same time he can show taking legal responsibility and legal sanctions, and we think that that's much more healthier, and that is why we propose.